I'm going to say a quick prayer. Father, Lord, we thank you for today. Bless the words that come out of my mouth. Let it minister to somebody in this congregation today to the glory of your name. Amen. The last couple of weeks, we've been hearing stories in the Bible. We heard Viv talk about the Samaritan woman who was at Jacob's well and how, Samaritans and Jews, their interaction, and how she went back into town and told everyone about somebody who knew everything about her. We also heard last week about the E plus R equals O formula. I'm a scientist, so I quite, that appealed to me a lot. It was the story of Daniel and how he chose not to be overwhelmed by the circumstances he found himself in, and how he allowed himself to produce measured outcomes, and then there were results or outcomes at the end of it. Today's story is a story you've probably heard before. Tracy did a lovely demo of today's talk with her beautiful quote. And I've titled the message from that story, Trust the Process. Now, the process can mean many things for a lot of people. A carpenter will have a piece of wood, and he can turn that into a lovely piece of furniture. That takes a process to achieve that. An artist will, look at a blank piece of canvas, take some oil and his brushes, and the Mona Lisa will come up and be displayed at, large museums. God has blessed me with the ability to do a job. I'm a cardiologist. I sometimes have to put a wire and a fine tube into a rather obscure opening in a patient's heart. And we have x-rays to guide us, but it's not always perfect. And there's a point in the procedure where essentially you're flying blind, right? I hope that doesn't scare too many people. But what it is years and years of training has taught me techniques and manipulations, and at that point, when I get there, I know that if I turn 20 degrees, pull back 4 centimeters, and various things I could do, I will eventually get that tube in, I will get my lead in, the procedure will finish successfully, and the patients will get significant benefit from it. Am I scared when I'm faced in that situation? Yes, because I'm human, and the margins of error are so small. I've got wires in patients' hearts. But it's very easy to follow a man-made process. Many people have come before me. They've read, they've analyzed the anatomy of the human body. I've gone and I've read it myself, and I've practiced, and I follow the process. If I trust the process, I'll get the result. If I follow the process, I'll get the result. And that's usually what happens. So man-made processes are quite easy to follow. We follow the rules of the land, etc. God's processes, on the other hand, are sometimes illogical. They blow my mind. It doesn't make any sense. Half the time you're trying to make sense of something that you probably will never be able to understand in your own lifetime. 1 Corinthians 1:27 says, God chooses the things the world considers foolish in order to shame those who think they're wise, and he chooses the things that are powerless to shame those who are powerful. So there isn't always a logic to how God operates within our own human mind, but there's always order. There's always order with the way God operates. So the story of Joseph, the backstory is actually quite an amazing one. It's an amazing story, but full of a lot of chaos. His great-grandfather was Abraham, to whom a great promise had been made. You were going to be the father of many nations. You were going to own this land. You were going to have multiple descendants, and they were going to all benefit from that. His grandfather was Isaac, and his father was Jacob, who was a twin. Jacob had, also known as the deceiver, had basically stolen the birthright of Esau. He'd been on the run from his brother for several years, and they had just essentially made peace recently. His wife, Rachel, his second wife, Rachel, who he had toiled 14 years for before he was allowed to marry, had also just passed away while giving birth to the youngest child, Benjamin. He also had 11 brothers, Benjamin being the last born. His 10 older brothers had committed every crime possible. They had done the worst of the land. They had shamed their father. They committed murder as well. And this is where our story begins, because even though it's not entirely clear why, we can make some assumptions. His father seems to have made him the favorite child. Maybe because Jacob had followed the statutes his father had followed, maybe because Jacob had done something, Joseph rather had done something to, suggest that he loved God as much as Jacob did. Genesis 37:3 says, because he was born to him in his old age, as an explanation for why Joseph was the favorite child. But then, what about Benjamin? Most lastborns are a favorite child. Or maybe because Rachel died during the birth of Benjamin. Maybe there was some pain or hurt associated with that. Rather naively, maybe, Jacob proceeds to present Joseph with a coat of many colors. He'd openly shown that he was his favorite child, but then he was now going to put a target on his back by giving him this beautiful coat, which none of his brothers had. I've got 2 young children. That's not the kind of schoolboy error I'm going to make, I'm still at the ages where you buy a child a birthday present, you have to buy something else just so that the other one doesn't feel left out. So he's 17 years old now, and essentially his father had put him in some sort of supervisory role for all his affairs. He was the one his father trusted to go out, see what his brothers were doing, come back and tell him, to manage things in a way that he felt was, how he wanted things to be done. Now, he was 17. He had Reuben and Simeon and Levi. He had much older brothers, but he was the one that Jacob actually trusted. His brothers obviously hated him even more for that, because he was in a position where he was actually the one that was favorite. He had this beautiful coat. He was the one that was responsible for all the affairs, even though he was quite a young child at the time. And to compound matters, he started to have dreams. Dreams which he openly tells everybody, leaves open to interpretation as well. His bundle of grain being bowed down by his brother's bundles of grain, the sun, the moon, and the stars, the 11 stars all bowing down before him. The absolute arrogance. If you were one of his brothers, you probably thought, seriously, could you have a more annoying little brother, if you like? So one day, his brothers are out shepherding the flock, and Jacob sends him out and says, go have a look at what they're doing, come back and bring me a report. Now you can imagine that months, probably years of anger towards their brother, all pent up inside them. They see this favorite child, dreamer, who was in essence predicting that at some point everybody was going to be bowing down towards. They saw him coming, and they thought, this is our chance, we've got to take it. And in verse 20 of Genesis 37, it says, let us kill him and throw him into the cisterns. We'll see what becomes of his dreams. Now, of course, they didn't kill him, if you read through Genesis 37, because perhaps Reuben, suddenly overcome by some sense of responsibility, prevented that from happening, convinced his brothers that that wasn't the right thing to do, and thought, let's just put him in the well, let him suffer a bit. But actually, in verse 22, Reuben was actually planning to secretly come back and rescue Jacob and return him to his father. But he took his eye off the ball, Reuben that is, and Judah connived with his other brothers to sell him off for 20 pieces of silver. So Joseph is sold off for 20 pieces of silver. There's all this, Jesus was betrayed by 30 pieces of silver in the Bible, 20 pieces of silver. In today's money, it's probably around 300, 400 pounds. If they divided it equally among themselves, everybody got 30 pounds. 30 quid to sell off your brother. Joseph had done absolutely nothing wrong. He'd done nothing wrong up until this point. He'd actually been honest. He'd followed his father's rules. He'd followed the rules of the land. He'd followed the statutes of his father's God. He'd done all that he should. He had dreams, and he openly mentioned those dreams. So actually, he never interpreted the dreams. He just said them out. His father reprimanded him for having the dreams, but his father also took a step back and tried to consider what those dreams might mean. But he finds himself a slave all of a sudden. Now, slaves have a very hard life and are never treated right. I come from a family of slaves. That's where I get my surname from, Savage. So I know a bit about that. But this is where Joseph's trouble really started. He's now 28 years old and he's in Potiphar's house. Potiphar is the captain of the king's guard, Pharaoh. Pharaoh is the king of Egypt. It's an influential household. Not that Joseph would have realized at the time, but that from verse 2 of Genesis 39, we start to see how God is showing himself to Joseph. We don't get a sense of whether Joseph knows that this is what is happening, but it's there for us to read. From verse 2, and I'm going to read and paraphrase as well, the Lord was with Joseph, so he succeeded in everything he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. Potiphar noticed this and realized that the Lord was with Joseph. Potiphar noticed this, giving him success in everything he did. In verse 4, he said, this pleased Potiphar, so he soon made Joseph his personal attendant. He put him in charge of his entire household and everything he owned. It goes on to describe how the house of Potiphar was blessed because of Joseph. His affairs ran smoothly, his crops and livestock all flourished, just because Joseph was present in that household. He soon gave him full administrative responsibility. And in verse 6 it says, and with Joseph there, Potiphar had no worries except what kind of food to eat. That is the highest level of luxury, I think. If I had somebody who looked after everything, which I do, my beautiful wife at the back, and I only had to worry about what to eat, that is a good place to be. We have the first reading, actually, Isaiah 22, verse 22 to 23, if you can put that up on the wall, on the screen. And I'm reading from the New Living Translation. It says, I will give him the key to the house of David, the highest position in the royal court. When he opens doors, no one will be able to close them. When he closes doors, no one will be able to open them. He will bring honor to his family name, for I will drive him firmly in place like a nail in the wall. So Potiphar saw something in Joseph that jealousy obviously prevented his brothers from seeing. Potiphar was Egyptian, Joseph wasn't. They had different traditions, different customs, different gods. But Potiphar realized that what was in Joseph was good, and he wanted a bit of it, even if it was by association. I guess in many ways, that's a reflection on us, There's something in us that people should see that should make them want to be part of us. That's our own testimony. And sometimes you don't even have to speak. Sometimes it's just your actions. In fact, a lot of the times it's your actions. Your actions is what draws people in, makes people see. So, of course, all is going well in Joseph's life at this point. Everything is going well. Potiphar is seeing that God is with Joseph. But Potiphar's wife was also seeing something in Joseph. And it wasn't God. She was seeing all that was physically good about Joseph, a young, handsome, tall man. And she made her move on him. Joseph, of course, resisted and resisted. There was lots of pressure. But one day she entraps him. In Genesis 39, verse 17 to 18, she's telling Potiphar a story about her interaction with Joseph, or her latest interaction with Joseph. She says, that Hebrew slave you brought into our house tried to come in and fool around with me, she said. But when I screamed, he ran outside and left his cloak with me. We know that's not true, as actually what happened was that she tried to force herself on him, and while he was trying to escape, he left his coat. But she kept it as evidence to back up her story. Imagine Potiphar coming back in and thinking, look, this man who essentially had given full responsibility of everything in my life, everything, literally, why would he do something like this to me? He believed his wife's story, took Joseph and threw him into prison, where all the king's prisoners were held. And there he remained for the second time in Joseph's life, while doing exactly what God had asked him to do, while doing right, doing everything correctly. Yet he's found himself in another pickle. He's been thrown into prison. The God he had served essentially was abandoning him. Listen, there was a lot of injustice that must have been, heavy on his mind. What was the point? What is the point? What is the point? I do everything right. I become a slave. Manage to work my way up into the king's guard's house. Do everything right. I become a prisoner. Everything was going wrong. So he's in prison. And, sometimes you think about, well, he's just gone into prison. And then the way the Bible and, those who have written and placed things in the book, the chronology sometimes, we mustn't forget that being in prison involves shackles and hard labor and work and torment. And he was going through all of that every single day as a prisoner. It wasn't silver cutlery. It wasn't, warm coffee or tea. He was suffering. In Genesis 39, verse 21, but the Lord was with Joseph in prison and showed him his faithful love and made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners. And over everything that happened in prison, it's a pattern, isn't it? A pattern is happening. In the same way he was put in charge Potiphar's house, is the same way he's now been put in charge in prison. Verse 23 of Genesis 39, the warden had no more worries because Joseph took care of everything. The Lord was with him and caused everything he did to succeed. Now Joseph is in prison and he is making the prison warden look like the best prison warden there ever was. Everything is working. Probably calm prisons, no revolts. He's not having to do much work. And here he meets two important people, the chief baker and the cupbearer. They were high royals working for the king, but they'd offended him, so Pharaoh had put them in prison. And they had dreams, both of them. Joseph sees them worried and asks them what the matter was. And they replied, we both had dreams last night, but no one can tell us what they mean. It's the first time Joseph actually is interpreting a dream. Because remember, when he told his dreams, he just told his dreams. He didn't give an interpretation, even though it was kind of clear to our eyes what those dreams meant. But he acknowledges God here. And perhaps a lesson, going by what Tracy had said, maybe there was a bit of an arrogance with the presentation of the dream the first time. Maybe he needed to be cut down to size. Who knows? But in Genesis 48, he says, interpreting dreams is God's business. Go ahead and tell me your dreams. So I'll tell you your dreams. Well, it's God's business. It's kind of like sometimes people say to me, I say, because I do some emergency work, and the most dramatic recovery happens when people come in a real emergency state, and then they're better, They're literally really sick, and the next minute they're sitting up on the ward drinking a cup of coffee. So people are very effusive, and they say, "Doctor, you saved my life." I think, no, I didn't. And it used to be a bit awkward at times because I really don't want to take that kind of glory, I really don't. I never do. I say a prayer before I cut any patient open. I say a prayer before I do anything, really. I don't live a perfect life. My life is certainly far from perfect. But I always acknowledge that God is in charge and is ahead. Interpreting dreams is God's business. Go ahead and tell me your dreams. So when they say, "Oh, you saved my life," I say, "No, thank God." Thank God for that. So he interprets the dreams accurately, to the T. He says the chief baker will be executed, and the cupbearer, he says, will be restored to his former position. Now, of course, years in prison, and the strain and the stress, he sees his chance here. The chief baker, well, you're going to be executed. You're no use to me. The cupbearer, you're probably going to be put back into your position. I better come to you and tell you what I really want. And so he makes a plea to the cupbearer. This is the first time that we actually feel the weakness, if you like, all the challenges. Genesis 40:14. "And please remember me and do me a favor when things go well for you. Mention me to Pharaoh so he may get me out of this place. For I was kidnapped from my homeland," true, "the land of the Hebrews, and now I'm here in prison, but I did nothing to deserve it," also true. His interpretations of the dreams came true, and in the final verse of that chapter, Genesis 40, verse 23, Pharaoh's cupbearer, however, forgot all about Joseph as soon as he was taken out, never giving him another thought. We're coming to the end of the message. Never giving him another thought. But if we put ourselves in Joseph's shoes, at that point, he probably thought, "I found somebody who's going to get out there and speak on my behalf and champion my cause and just, get things moving for me. Days, weeks, surely it's coming now. Surely I'm going to hear the rattling of the keys and somebody's going to open the door and say, 'Joseph, let's go. You're a free man.'" Weeks turn to months. 2 full years, actually. 2 full years. Enough time for his loss to be magnified, his hope to diminish as much as possible. Most of us, as part of a shock response, some of it is medical as well. When you are faced with tragedy, you try really hard. There's that initial period where you try really hard. We talk about denial, the 5 stages of grief. And the biblical representation is we draw on, some kind of grace to sustain that tragedy. We go really hard with our faith. The problem with all of that is, 1, we're human. 2, time. Time is a killer. Time can draw out a lot. Time can make things become so much harder to deal with. Joseph, Daniel, and Job, the important things about the way they live their lives and the way we live our lives now is because we always make an excuse for God. We always try to manage our expectations of how God should have behaved in a particular situation. We limit what God actually has control over with the statements we make when we're faced with tragedy. They never did that. It was hard for Joseph, but he trusted in his convictions. He tried to stay true to who he was. People are going to fail you. They always will. People will disappoint you. People will leave you hanging dry. They always will. The only person that won't is God, really. He's the one person that we can always trust on. The one person that we know that it doesn't change. We are the ones that change every time. He stays constant. He's not a man that he should lie. 2 years later, Joseph is eventually invited to the palace to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. He's had lots of dreams. Nobody could interpret it. And he gives advance warning of 7 years of famine and the preparations that must be put into place. As a result, he gets exalted to the highest position in the courts with only Pharaoh above him. Essentially, he was maybe like a prime minister to the queen. Or should we not talk about prime ministers? Genesis 41:57. And people from all around came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine, which Joseph had predicted, was severe throughout the world. People came to Egypt. The people included Jacob's brothers. Now you can read about the stories leading to their reunion from chapter 42 to 45. But I'll end the story here with a statement that Joseph makes when he reveals his identity to his brothers. He says, "But don't be upset and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place." This is several years later. He's saying, don't be upset, don't be angry for selling me. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. The famine that has ravaged the land for 2 years will last 5 more years. And there will neither be plowing nor harvesting. God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive and to preserve many survivors. If you put up the reading from John 9, if you don't mind. Jesus' disciples are asking him, "Rabbi, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sins?" It was not because of his sins or his parents' sins, Jesus answered. This happened so that the power of God could be seen in him. God's process in truth is quite simple. He starts off, there's a promise, and there's several things that have to happen to get to the end result. The end result really was preserving the promise that he has made to Abraham. There was no chance of multiplying his family and multiple descendants and, being the father of all nations. If they all died in a famine that was going to ravage the entire land, he sent Joseph ahead. It was a process at the start, and everything started with a promise. The complexity that we have to deal with as humans is time, and we have very, very little concept of it. What does a day or a year mean in the eyes of God? What does it mean when we have a problem that seemingly doesn't go away? Have we offended God? Is it because of our sin? Or is it all pointless? I say we should trust God's process because he's always true. He never lies, and he never changes. It's always been the same. Humans have changed for years. God has always been constant. I'll end with this prayer I saw a lot of while I was growing up. Many of you know the Serenity Prayer. I say it all the time. I pray that God grants us the serenity to accept the things that we cannot change, the courage to change the things that we can, actually go ahead and change the things that we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.